Middle East conflicts explained. The clearest example of the consequences of early 20th century colonial interventions in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestine conflict. The ongoing struggle to control the historically significant territory of Palestine's former British Mandate remains one of the crucial ongoing global disputes rooted in historical religious and ethnic conflicts and created because of Western colonial powers' actions. Another conflict that can be embedded in foreign powers' intervention in the Iraq Civil War began due to the United States invasion and lack of a successful strategy to assist in the state-building process necessary after the toppling of the Hussein regime. The many errors of the Allies in Iraq remain one reason the radical ISIS fighters could take a hold of the fragile nation. The common aspect of most ongoing conflicts in the Middle East traces back to the partitions agreed upon by Western powers, especially the United Kingdom and France, in the 20th century, and a disregard for the territory's social and ethnic backgrounds that created arbitrary states without a sense of national identity, sometimes grouping ethnic groups that had long conflicted. In the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the UK was a proponent of Jewish immigration to Palestine's then Mandate, a territory inhabited by Jews and Arabs from biblical times. However, Britain did not consider the majority Arab population that historically inhabited the area since Jews were expelled over a millennium ago, and how the return of Jewish settlements to occupy the land would undoubtedly lead to conflict. The conflicts that arose were exacerbated by the UK's poor handling of the situation and Britain's competing promises to each side involved in the conflict. In the case of the Iraq Civil War and rebel insurgency, it was due to the lack of a coherent plan to assist in building state institutions after the assassination of longtime Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein and creating a centralized state on the nation that lacked a unison central identity. The lack of consideration for domestic factors led to the grave mistake of banning any individuals tied to the ruling party from participating in government, creating a power vacuum that facilitated the rise of ISIL and other militant radical groups. The United Kingdom signed the Balfour Declaration because the domestic political elite believed the Jewish community's support was crucial to allow Britain a victory in the First World War. The increase in Jewish settlers' numbers led to subsequent religious and ethnic clashes with the native Palestinians, giving birth to the ongoing conflict. The conflict resolution did not seem to be possible now, and countless lives have been lost to the outgoing conflict and the continuous occupation of Palestine by Israel. In the Iraqi War, the United States invaded to overturn Saddam Hussein's regime, who was believed to have weapons of mass destruction and accused by the U.S. of supporting al-Qaeda rebels responsible for the 9/11 attacks. The Iraqi invasion's actual reasons remain in doubt due to recent conflicting information regarding the intelligence supplied to justify the war. The consequences of Western interventions in the Middle East have, without a doubt, left a negative impact on the region's sociological and political landscape. An ongoing civil conflict that escalated into a civil war and is considered a proxy war is the Syrian civil war. The internal factions are the ruling President Bashar al-Assad's regime and its allies against the rebel forces composed of several factions, the Syrian ISIS rebels and its partners on the one hand and the Kurds with competing interests. The leading Middle Eastern powers involved in this conflict are Iran and Saudi Arabia, supporting the government and the opposition. Another battleground where Saudi Arabia and Iran have sought to extend their influence for decades is Bahrain. Bahrain has a prominent level of geopolitical importance for both states, given its proximity to Saudi Arabia and its role within the GCC. The conflict's internal factions are the ruling Al Khalifa family, supported and believed to be the Saudis' puppet regime. The ongoing uprisings led by the Shia Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain supported by Iran. In the Syrian civil war, Iran supports the ruling government due to its long-time sphere of influence over Syria, and the historically strategic importance of having a friendly ally in the region, as well as fears of a Syrian rapprochement towards the Gulf monarchies, the Saudis if the opposition managed to install a Sunni fundamentalist regime. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia and its allies support the rebels in hopes of weakening Iran and its influence in the region by supporting the installment of a Sunni-led Syrian government that would shift the balance of power in the area and give the Saudis a strategic ally in the so-called Arab Cold War. Examples of the involvement of both nations in the conflict are numerous. The Saudis have provided extensive financial and logistical support to the rebels, training, and military capabilities. The Iranian government has also offered the ruling regime of Bashar al-Assad with significant economic and military support, even sending troops to aid the government, and usefully propping up the ruling faction's capacity to sustain the conflict while suffering many casualties. The Iranian and Saudi governments have also lobbied the international community for support to their respective sides, further cementing the conflict's proxy war aspect. In the second conflict, both factions are also guided by a geopolitical game of influence. The Kingdom of Bahrain has historically been under Saudi control and its proximity makes it a natural ally of the Gulf monarchy. Iran has seen the conflict as an opportunity to assert its influence in the region and, in supporting the rebel uprising, aims to weaken Saudi power in the area and gain a nice post close to the Saudi territorial sphere. The reasoning for the foreign forces' involvement is multifaceted, having the Al Saud family concerned at the increasing power of the rebels and the Shia in Bahrain and its influence on the Shia population of the neighboring eastern province of the Saudi kingdom. On the other hand, for the Iranian government, Bahrain provides an opening to increase its influence and power both internally and in the eyes of the regional and global community. In February of 2011, the longtime ruling dictator President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt was forced to resign following a widespread popular uprising against his government. The provisional interim government led by the armed forces sponsored a referendum in March of the same year that approved measures to make elections more open, imposed term limits, and restricted emergency decrees. The country seemed to head towards a democratic and free ruling political system. A legislature and new president, Mohamed Morsi, were elected in what was considered free and fair elections. The country also embarked on the task of drafting a new constitution as the world cheered at the prospect of a democratic trend in the region. Iran also experienced some encouraging signs around the so-called Arab Spring. Unprecedented widespread protests followed the 2009 presidential election, which was widely considered fraudulent and resulted in the defeat of a widely supported reformist candidate. The Green Movement, led by supporters of the opposition, began to organize massive demonstrations not seen since the revolution of 1979 that called for new elections and the reform of the political system to allow free and fair elections, as well as freedom of speech. Egypt seemed to have started a successful transition to democracy. However, the prospect of a democratic state emerging from the ousting of Mubarak was short-lived. The fears amongst the secular elites that a Muslim-led government with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood would begin to eliminate freedoms and impose religious doctrine led to widespread protests and culminated in a military-supported coup that removed the recently elected President Morsi from power and installed another secular military dictatorship like the Mubarak regime. The moment of democratization came full circle and ended in an even more brutal authoritarian regime. The situation in Iran was even more precarious for the prospects of a positive process of democratization. The ruling government had a repressive and robust response to the protests. A more conservative and reactionary wing of the theocracy has since taken hold of Iranian politics. The minimal concessions made during the reformist period were overturned, setting Iran back in many aspects of political and human rights. The consequence of the initial wave of modernization and freedoms was the birth of a paranoid fear amongst the ruling class that such openings would give the opportunity for a takeover of the reins of power and resulted in an even harsher response to the protests and the prospects of liberalization of the country. The hopes for democratization did not sadly materialize, neither in Iran nor Egypt, and none can be considered a democracy now. There was never a successful democratization process in the recent years on Iran's case, and the prospect remains utterly grim. The most blatant culprit for Iran's descent into theocracy rule was that the United States supported the coup that overthrew Mossadegh's democratically elected government in 1953. The most recent attempts have, however, been quashed by internal conflicts and failed revolutions rooted in the lack of unison opposition to the ruling regime.